the Association students. Oh, thank you, Naomi, of AMTAS. And then Naomi is with us and Megan. So if you two would like to introduce yourselves.
Hi, everybody. My name is Naomi. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the current president of AMTAS.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm the treasurer of AMTAS and also she, her pronouns.
Awesome. And then without further ado, we would love to introduce our presenter, our collaborator, our speaker tonight, Dr. Marisol Norris. Thank you again for coming.
Just wanted to say again, thank you. I'm excited to be here with you all and to have an opportunity to be in conversation. These are the times that I love when people come together and kind of discuss different ideas, see how they function in our lives outside of papers, outside of books, and in real life, and to be really in community with you all. So I'm so glad to be sharing.
Yep. So we just wanted to host this event to kind of introduce our passages theme this year, building a new foundation. We wanted to ground ourselves in this wonderful work that we had read by Dr. Marisol Norris. Sorry, the brain is slipping today. But the article that y'all read, What Needs to Die in Music Therapy to Preserve Human Dignity. And so our theme for passages this year, building a new foundation, is all in a growth mindset of, examining implicit bias, examining how we are contributing to harm in our world, and examining how we cause harm, how our system incurs danger in all the ists of our society, and how we can begin the work and continue the work and being the best therapist we can be by examining these deep questions. So thank you again, Dr. Marisol Norris, for being here to facilitate us today.
So I'm taking it, Grace, that you're passing the mic here in this moment.
Officially, yes.
It's official. And I'm also kind of looking through the Zoom room. I'm seeing people that I know, very familiar faces. So whoop whoop to Leslie. I see Leslie. I see some Drexel here as well too. So very excited again to be sharing. Before we kind of I delve into kind of a little bit of an overview of the article and the background of why I wrote it, I actually want to kind of set the scene, set the context. So if you would allow me just to kind of first start off with a video, I think that would give us a great entryway into more discussion. So give me 1 second, I'll go ahead and share screen. Oh my Lord. Come on, just got a home at last. Oh my Lord. Come on, it's not a home at last. Mona, ain't you tired of moaning? Fall down on your knees and join the band with the angels singing. No harm, no harm, no harm. Tell brother Elisha, no No harm or motor's got a home at night. Oh my Lord. One motor's got a home at night. All right, so I share that to really just give us a landing point. You know, when I originally wrote this commentary, we were all navigating actually, you know, the realities of COVID, the realities of Black Lives Matters movement kind of coming to a critical point in our, not only our US context, but in this kind of globalized context. And for me, I was in this kind of space. I think I just left, you know, my teaching at Lesley, and I had a lot of space at home, thinking about, you know, what does it mean for me as a Black cis woman, immigrant of African Jamaican heritage, working class background, that has invisible disability, that's still kind of exploring my own sexuality, my own gender identity, and really grappling with all of these different ideas, not only living as concepts in my mind, but in the flesh, in our bodies, right? In real time, and really thinking about that in connection to my relationship to the profession of music therapy. And that, you know, kind of all the different aspects of our work within music therapy. And, you know, in the forefront of my mind was this idea of course, life and death. And so in some ways, you know, the article is not that, you know, unexpected, that we're thinking about life and we're thinking about cycles and kind of looking at our, in a kind of existentialist kind of way, thinking about our mortality. But there was a piece of it that I thought that was necessary, and that oftentimes we don't often think of how physical death is connected to a social death, right? And the other piece of that, or to kind of give an explanation of that, the idea that we actually live and exist on multiple continuums, right? So thinking about that, if we're thinking about like a dialectic, yeah, you know, understandings of actual physical ending, right, is actually part and connected to a social reality too, right? Not even kind of taking that whole continuum and like stretching it and moving it and querying it and doing all these other things to it that would actually kind of even take it outside of these just single lines. But thinking that there are these two kind of pivotal points that we're looking at that are never really connected or talked about in the practice of music therapy. And then for me, it was thinking about, while this is so amplified in every aspect of our life, what were the reasons why we could not find ways to tether what was happening on the political stage or on the world stage with what was happening in our classrooms, what was happening in our organizations, what were happening in, you know, therapeutic sessions, what was happening, you know, in passing in a hallway with a peer, you know, why we couldn't figure out all those different pieces, or not even that we couldn't figure it out, we wouldn't even acknowledge it. And so for me, a lot of the article was kind of rooted in this idea of Black protest, which I think has been, in Black movements, which have been in many ways the underlining current through a lot of different activist movements, right? But also the reality that in order for music therapy as a profession to start seeing our lives connected to the political, we need to be able to see the political through lines in all aspects of our work. And so, you know, what you see on, you know, the latest reality show is connected to music therapy. Are you able to make that bridge? You know, what pops up on your phone is somehow connected to music therapy as well. And not just for, you know, the cool song that kind of comes up and kind of decontextualized from its actual context, but there are these different histories, there are these different narratives, there are these various associations to music, to song, and then there's these relational aspects of our work that needed to be amplified and to be made political. So in the writing that was very much focused on the idea of Blackness and Black humanity, that was also spawned from, Breonna Taylor's death and George Floyd's death and Tony McDade's death and all these many deaths that kind of kept on going, right? And a long string of deaths before that. It was really to honor their existence and then to reconnect our profession back to this idea of people, like outside of just theory and music and sound and song, but being with people that wasn't rooted in any kind of ideological or professional need for goodness, professional need for legitimacy, or needs for power. And so it was like, how do we turn our profession on top of its head so we can recognize not only from like this developmental stance of being of some kind of doing professional good, but being able to critique that out of care for the whole profession or care for our own practice, and then more importantly, care for the people that we serve. So a lot of the writings were really kind of based upon that inherent need. And in saying that, thinking about how it would be a disservice to our profession if we continue to be ahistorical, apolitical, contextualized, and all the other A words that you could probably find too, aestheticized, I don't know, probably some long words. But the idea of uprooting our work from its actual origins was perpetuating a type of harm that needed to be repaired, and to allow ruptures to continue without at least being acknowledged was at that moment my current focus.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Marisol Norris. And
Grace, call me Marisol. It's fine.
Okay. Oh my God. At Alverno, we call everybody by first name, so I never know. All right. Well, thank you so much,
Marisol. So it's all right.
Okay. Oh, good. Thank you, Marisol. And on that, we would love to open this up to kind of a Q&A talk back with everybody present here. If you have a question for Marisol or something you want to bring to the good of the group and to discuss and hash out, please either put in the chat or if you raise your hand, we can call on you and you can speak it aloud. Does anybody have anything to start? All right. Oh, Tara or Tara?
It doesn't matter. Either's fine.
Okay, well, go ahead, please.
So I'm just wondering, in terms of all these issues, I know this is kind of a really big, somewhat loaded question, but where can we start in making these kind of changes, beyond having the conversations? Like it's so great to see these conversations starting to happen and these papers being written, but where do we go from here, and how does it eventually trickle down from having these conversations within the organization to actually within our music therapy practice?
So I think there's a both and approach to most of this. And actually, I feel like the answers to these questions probably lie already in this room. So there's an element of that where, I'm not the holder of all the answers in this space. But I think it exists in multiple places. I think it exists in your classrooms, kind of interrogating the types of readings that are presented, acknowledging and including ideas around politics as an entry point in probably the first class that you've ever taken around music therapy, seeing that as a foundational aspect of our work, because it's about culture, and culture is really about social learning, right? And so if we're kind of going from context to context, then kind of not only seeing culture as some kind of add-on, but seeing it as actually the air that we breathe would be an entryway into these conversations. And then kind of thinking about education as being a primary space, really thinking about our standards of practice, our competencies that guide our education being a place to critique and explore. So that's like more of ideas around professional starts, right? Organizational starts. But when I think about, okay, me, myself, I have my own stuff that I got to work through, and I had my own stuff that led me and propelled me to these conversations. Oftentimes I think about finding yourself within the actual dialogue and seeing where your humanity lies within the dialogue as a critical place. Because oftentimes, so to be very honest, I don't think that people usually start off in these conversations thinking about, oh, the clients, they're going through so much harm. Like when you grapple with politics and politics that you don't really want to work with, it's usually somehow you feel it in your body, or you feel it on some level when you have an engagement with someone and it doesn't feel right? It's unsettling. And so in that point, you're kind of thinking about, what is the purpose of the conversation? Yes, the purpose is to be better for your clients or your service recipients or your patients, whatever language you're using. But also it's about being able to recognize that in some ways, there's a dehumanization that exists within each one of us when we're not able to engage with these concepts, right? And not be able to engage with it with a level of fluidity that therapists need to have if we're thinking about ourselves as instruments, right? Persons of the therapist, self as instrument. What it means that if all this information and our relationships with clients actually kind of funnel through us, and the music that we have kind of funnels through not only our kind of mirrored play of music or anything, it actually funnels through all of our implicit biases and funnels through all those spaces. And then thinking that, on the other hand, there's a lot of dialectics in these conversations. And I would love to see how we queer those two and shift those two. But the idea that to look at someone's freedom, right? To strip someone from their own freedom is a dehumanization, right? And we think about that. But to also be the person that's in power and doesn't acknowledge someone else's freedom, that's a dehumanized existence too, right? And so being able from those spaces, thinking, one, there's a purpose and there's a need, there's actual social and a existential impact on me as well, my ability to serve, my ability to be in relationship with myself, the range of relationship that I can have with myself. We think about range of affect for clients. We need to think about the range of experiences that a therapist is able to engage with when not allowing themselves to go into these various aspects of their own place and personhood. And then beyond that, kind of thinking about that, if that is one of the first steps, which I think is what Sue Hadley and I were trying to speak about in that article around the first step, was like, it's not necessarily that it's to learn someone else's music or to get it all right. It's actually about the filter in which all of that exists in. That is the main point of focus. I remember, and there's multiple points of this. I remember, a student really being focused on getting a particular run right. Someone said you need to have soul, right, in order to sing this particular song for a client. I think it was a supervisor talking to a supervisee, and it was group supervision. We were talking about it, right? And the student was just like, I'm trying to figure it out. I can't sound more soulful, right? And it was racking the student's brain. And I was like, okay, how about we just stop and say, you haven't explored that aspect of yourself beyond the formation of runs and sounds. But there's also another element, if we get really deep around it, is thinking about what's soul music about? It's about actually connecting with pain and woundedness and and joy that's a part of that, but there's actually a deeper connection to how we even move through music that's connected to just awareness, acknowledgement, and then proximity. And so like that then becomes another aspect of this work, of being able to get proximal to pain, proximal to struggle. That might be listening more, talking less sometimes. That sometimes might be talking more and making all the mistakes, you know, in spaces that will allow for that, and hopefully in spaces where supervision exists to move through that. But I think that there are actually multiple ways of entry outside of maybe typical presentations and books and things of that. It's actually about being proximal and being in relationship with yourself, and then learning how to be in relationship with people that you find sameness, which is oftentimes not looked at, and then also people that there is distinct difference. I mention sameness because oftentimes there's complicity in sameness, right? And so it's like, how do you have authentic relationship with someone while you watch them kind of make mistakes, fumble around things, hurt and harm people, but you never really speak honestly with them about how that might make you feel, how that might make someone else feel. And so it's like, how do we move away from kind of superficial performative relationships and the masks that we hold as human beings and also as professionals, and then actually get real with each other, which is another kind of aesthetic for many different cultures, about being real and authentic and actually speaking things in spaces that would actually allow for growth and development. And I would love to even hear what other people's thoughts are, again, about that, because I think that there are a lot of great spaces to exist. It might actually be in the music too, because we often avoid the music because there's actually ways in which we push through into music as well.
Go ahead, Casey.
Yeah, I liked what you were saying about it's almost like you have to bring a level of presence, like when you're with someone that has, you know, differences, but also the sameness in between you, because it's like that level of presence can lead so much deeper into curiosity, and not just with the music, like something that's beyond the music, curiosity with someone else's presence in a room, like that in itself, because I feel like that can bring just so much that can be overlooked, like what you can learn just by being with someone instead of just diving into books and diving into these conversations. It's like that relationship I just think is so much more tangible and like deeper connecting, like in my experience, like deeper connecting in my soul, so that like and it feels real. Books kind of feel like, it's not like they feel fake, but they feel less tangible, and it's real life practice.
And it can be different things for different people, right? And actually, I think there should be multiple things for everyone. so it's like if you're landing in solely, you know, in kind of making relationships with people that are similar and different from you, it might be you making relationships, but you've never had the conversation. Or you might be having the conversation and enacting a whole lot of harm, but no one's at a place where they want to share that with you yet. Or they go and kind of take care of themselves in other spaces, because it doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship that's created is an authentic one, right? Or a one that is, it might be questions around authenticity. What is authenticity? But it might be something that is not really rooted in unconditional positive regard, that actually leads to kind of understanding, you know, where we navigate that. So I think there's actually multiple ways to enter into these conversations, and the reality is that there actually needs to be an applied use of all of these different techniques. You know, you find out how you navigate them best, but I think at the center of all of this is this idea of critical reflexivity, right? Because oftentimes what we don't recognize and we don't acknowledge within these processes are our cultural defenses, right? You know, and how they also exist within therapeutic space. So For example, like color evasiveness. What does that mean? Where everyone is just a human, and no one has any kind of cultural distinction outside of, or racial distinction outside of, what maybe a therapist or the person kind of doing the critical analysis is allowed to presume. Or sometimes we ignore this kind of our over-identification with people that may be suffering as a way to kind of ease our own pain or ease our own guilt and shame. Guilt and shame are actually really effective tools if they're used appropriately, because they're supposed to move you to something. When you get stuck and stagnant in that thing, then it becomes something different. But there's like a lot of different defense dynamics that do exist that we need to unpack in order to be able to effectively move through that. The length in which we get to that, if we're kind of just thinking about it as, a relational experience, is one thing. But as therapists, we actually are beholden to, whether it's in our competencies or our standards of practice or not, we're actually beholden to an ethical code that requires us not to do harm. So then where it comes with, there's actually an expectation, I would say, to use all the different modes so that you are able to ensure that harm is reduced in every context that you engage in within a therapeutic space. So I think that the relational experience is important. Being present in a space, that can really actually create openness for authentic relationship, for the kind of politicized experiences to breathe and actually possibly move us past or beyond some of these different kind of stagnation points. However, they also, within our context, we have to have a deliberate and intentional way of addressing them. And that will actually take multiple axes. Some of it is personal reflection. Some of it is with people in the work. Some of it is speaking to truth to power and association and activism. But I think, and that could be a whole nother conversation and question in itself, but it actually takes multiple aspects of this work to be initiated and engaged in order to move us along at the rate in which we need to move in order to be effective as therapists. I love that concept, Casey, how you were doing that.
Thanks for the thoughtful response too. Like that it's set in like really deeply, because it's not just the relationships, it's what's the quality of the relationship? What is the relationship actually like for both individuals, instead of just maybe thinking you're not doing harm and that you are, but the other person doesn't feel safe enough to even speak up.
I also appreciated how you phrased like reducing harm, because I think so much of, at least in initiating or at least trying to address these, like how we contribute to harm or how we enact on, perceived biases, is so rooted in, well, if I just, read this book or I do this work, then I will never harm a person again. Or it's like this toxic wokeness idea of eventually you will know everything and can just be a phenomenal human being, where it's really just about, engaging with each person. There's always an opportunity to, and always a recognition that you can cause harm and you can make people feel uncomfortable and horrible, but you need to acknowledge that capability is always present.
And I think I remember I'm remembering it was probably around 2012, 2013. I think we were in the middle of the politics of our, the elections, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. And I think after the elections took place, we had a rise in conversation around politics within the profession of music therapy, as there was across, the nation. And I remember there was a certain point where all of a sudden everyone wanted to talk about race and culture. Everyone wanted to talk about gender or disability, but many people never really engaged with the concept before, right? I remember seeing a presentation that was like rooted in like Maya Angelou's work. And the therapist that was presenting on it said that critical race theory had nothing to do with their presentation, and that any type of, we're not looking from a political lens of the work. And I was like, how do you take something that is from a context and completely erase the context in order to engage with it within this profession? And so for me, it was interesting, because even in conversations, I think with Sue Hadley, we were like, okay, let's watch how this trend rises and let's wait to see when the dust settles, right? Because the idea that many were learning the words but weren't able to put it in practice, right? So you might have known all the lingo, but you couldn't even be in relationship with anyone. Like, people wouldn't want, you couldn't collaborate, you couldn't kind of move through space, beyond the ways in which you've typically navigated those spaces before. So yeah, you had the language for it, but were you able to be with people? Were you able to handle discomfort? Were you able to navigate those spaces? And I think there's a great place that you're talking about, Grace, where it's like, okay, what's the distinction also between language and performativity, performative allyship, right? And actually doing the work that would allow you to grow. And actually, performative allyship is a particular type of work. It shouldn't exist in therapy, right? Performative allyship. There should be actual joining that takes place, a power with, right? Not this kind of fake kind of power over kind of spaces. So really thinking about, what does that mean, and how does it manifest in our work beyond the words?
Go ahead, Taylor.
Yeah,
Your
we-
sound is not carrying through.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Yes. Okay, great. Thanks. So something you mentioned before is like sort of unpacking and taking off those masks and things like that. And I think humility has a lot to do with it, and it's unpacking and unlearning and relearning, and that is really hard to do. And as a student, I feel like it's a little bit easier because we are still learning and processing and moving through. But how do we can do so much with our own practice, but how do we change that into activism with those who don't engage in that? Can we do anything?
All right, so actually I have two thoughts to come in context. So one, and it's not a point of critique, it's a point of us kind of critically reflect on. So one, this idea of unlearning being difficult. I wonder about that, because entering into the field of music therapy, I had to learn a whole lot of stuff that weren't necessarily connected to the ways in which I understand music, the way in which I understood relationship, how music functioned in my community or communities around us. We had to learn a whole lot of different ways of theories and approaches that might not have been the original context in which we understand music per se, or care or caring, right? The ethics of that. And so I think that we actually put, I'm not saying that unlearning is a facade. I think it actually is a very intense process that might be more laden with our own defenses rather than it being laden with the actual process of unlearning. Because when you actually go through the process, it becomes easier over time to see something and enact change, right? Not to kind of think about all the behavioral approaches that we have, but you might have, once you've kind of created these kind of pattern behaviors over time where change is expected, you can make those shifts more readily. So unlearning in and of itself, I don't think is as detrimental, or I don't know what the word is, as loaded as we sometimes give. I think it's the defenses and the unconscious and sometimes conscious motivations around it, sometimes the political relationships and around the motivations of, if I say this or do this, will I get penalized in other spaces? It's sometimes the context in which you're existing in, where to unlearn something, you might be at a place where you are actively unlearning something, but you also might be in a place, a physical place, that penalizes you for making those strides in shifting your own consciousness, right? So there's an element of that I want to kind of acknowledge. And then There is, oh my goodness, Taylor, you had so many good questions and I only lingered on one. What was the rest of it? Oh, one more time. I can't hear. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. What were those when it comes to activism? Like, what is there anything we can do for those who are not interested in that critical reflexivity?
Yeah, and so then activism, another foundational concept. And the question actually that I ask, and I actually threw this out in foundations course at Drexel just this week or last week, it's like, what is the relationship between therapy and activism? Do we have roots in activism? Is it that far apart? And actually, I would like to throw it out because I don't like always hearing myself talk alone either. But it's like, what is our relationship to activism? Can we throw that out there, Grace? Is that all right if we kind of flip this a little bit?
Absolutely.
And no need to raise your little hand. If you want to add something, feel free to just unmute yourself or drop it in the chat.
And I say this not because I don't have answers, but I just really do believe in shifting these hierarchies of knowledge too, right? We have knowledge abundant in these spaces. What's the relationship to it? And there's not necessarily a wrong or right here. We're really trying to unpack these different ideas together. The relationship of therapy and activism, of our work and our practice with activism.
I think it's important. Sorry, I have a cat crawling over my lap. I'm doing my best focus. I think it's an important distinction, like, because most of the people that we as therapists are working with are in a marginalized group of some kind, whether it's disabled, whether it's LGBTQIA, and those are the people that we're most often that activism is needed for. So that's the big, I mean, that's a huge connection, is that they're often the people that we're servicing.
Yeah, there's links between the ways in which marginalization functions as our professional aim and our professional goals that is actually tethered to these ideas of activism, which is actually being agents, right? All of us being agents of some type of change. And then I would also add to that, Tara, that the idea that we as a professional field, social welfare, right, which is the origins of even our work, was based upon this idea of being able to, maybe it had some kind of ableist foundations and definitely racist foundations based upon different theories and contexts, you know, Freudian and Jungian work that were coming straight out of Nazi Germany at the time that was based on how to transform and shift or amplify certain ways of being. Like, there's histories to that. However, the ideas around social welfare have been at the root of how do we make change in our society, either one person at a time or shift a culture altogether. I sometimes think about Freud and his work. Yeah, Freud has a lot of different, there's a lot of stuff. It's loaded. But I remember when he first was working with the ideas of his histrionic, right? Histrionic women, right? These different ideas. And before it took its turn where it went, right? To actually marginalize and kind of have a heteropatriarchal kind of view of oppression, that oppressed women, right? Initially, it was based on this idea that there were so many women that were claiming harm in their households. And Freud was like, yo, I think people are experiencing rape throughout their communities. And for him, he was like, that was his initial impetus to now claim that this person is experiencing harm in their household. But as the numbers start rising, he had to come to a place where it's like, if this is actually true, I live in a society or in a world that is quite monstrous, right? And that was his writings around it. And then he took a decision to say, hey, no, I won't do that. I'll oppress women rather than acknowledge, the monstrosities of our life. But there was an element of that before some of the politics kind of further deepened that, the funding, who was going to amplify him, all those different things that came in. And Freud is not the origins of social welfare. However, there's different ideas around, what was what was the intended nature of our work, and seeing activism as not something that is a choice. It's actually what you're doing in sessions each day, if you're doing it right, in my mind. not in my mind, but if you're doing it right, you're usually supporting, co-laboring, creating spaces where people can empower themselves, be agented in their own regard, and access some point of freedom, not necessarily moving toward just optimal health, but in enacting freedoms in their life, whatever that might mean within their context, right? And so it's more of not the therapist doing, but the therapist being in these different spaces that allow for, and taking their own skill and their own knowledge that you've been trained with, to be able to further support in ways that there are liberatory processes and functions in music, that in ways that clients are able to access deeper and broader experiences of themselves, whether that be psychological, physical, what have you. So I think that there's a lot of that. And so the question then too that you're talking about, Taylor, about, how do we connect activism and our work? I was like, I think it's actually embedded in our work, but somehow we've kind of removed it. It's almost exercised it from the work as a need. What the needs are, I have theories around that, but out of a need to kind of recenter our own legitimacy and power, right, as a profession, which is linked to a lot of different things. It's sometimes linked to licensure. It's sometimes linked to our own, performance backgrounds. It's linked to a lot of different things that we need to kind of move beyond, our own development as a field that we need to kind of move beyond. And so I think that there's ways to further bolster that, to be able to kind of think of music therapy as not a singular marginalized profession, because I think we get wrapped up in that idea too, that we're a marginalized profession helping the marginalized people. But the idea is that we've actually aligned ourselves with power in so many different ways, whether that's Western classical music, whether that is dominant psychological frames, whether that is ableist ideas of the therapist client, those kind of hierarchical ideas of the therapist being the all-powerful therapist, and the client being the needy client that is not, it has no capacity to kind of make change for themselves. So there's elements of that, even though those aren't the foundations and the sole ways of understanding our work. If you look at our literature, if you look at our practice, like our standards of practice, if you look at our organizational structures, right? If you look at our cultures, whether they be cultures of consent, whether they be cultures of rape, whether it be cultures of oppression, whether it be all those different cultures, you kind of start reading between the lines to be able to say, okay, we're not functioning at the capacity in which we should be functioning. There might be some healthy functioning within groups, but as a professional body, there needs to be movement somewhere. And the movement might also be the unlearning that needs to happen, or the relearning, or the unpacking that needs to happen, or the repacking, or the kind of rehistoricizing the work, recontextualizing the work, and recentering those that are on the margins back into the center of the work too, to be able to notice that. I think that's something we saw with this Disabled Music Therapy Collective just a few years ago, or 1 year ago, I guess, that we're talking about the ways in which ability and access around various platforms within AMTA during the conference, how that would shift our understandings of ability and amplify so many ways in which ability is kind of uncritiqued, or has been uncritiqued for an extensive time in the mainstream. Not to say that people haven't been critiquing it over time. People typically are. We just never pay attention to them, or sometimes they're ostracized. So the idea is that activism has actually always been part of our work. We're just not amplifying the focus there, or we've reoriented our work to remove it for some other kind of legitimizing or power-laden motivation. And it's up to us to figure out which motivations are functioning in our particular contexts.
Awesome, and I'm seeing a response in the chat as well. I just want to read it out really quickly. Shelby says, my thoughts to the questions above, thinking of therapy as a resource for activism and social justice within the healthcare world. Therapists have the capacity to advocate for clients to receive services they need and also refer clients for other forms of healthcare that are essential to their overall well-being.
Yes, and so that's part of our own function, right? Advocacy is part of our own function. Thank you, Shelby.
Sorry, Marisol, were you going to say something?
I was just rereading that around what you noticed about we have the capacity to advocate for clients to receive services they need and also connect, refer. We have, I think the capacity is interesting because we have a function and we have access. The capacity of that really does lie in our consciousness around it, right? If we've become attuned to the needs of people around us and we've connected ourselves in certain spaces that would allow for that. And again, I keep on landing on the defenses because I see it at work and in function at a heightened level. Right? I think we can take I'm kind of just going where my brain goes. If I think about some of the recent conversations around intellectual property and plagiarism and theft, like we might be well-intended around things, but the capacity is actually limited sometimes based upon, as organizational structures and organizations mirror people, right? Run by people, right? The ways in which we're able to navigate that speaks to a limited sometimes capacity navigating those things, but it doesn't kind of overwhelm with the intention. There is an intention for it, and there is a function and a role and an expectation, but that capacity piece is where I'm really trying to kind of expose within this article as well. Like, are we recognizing the capacity? And a lot of the different ideas around, the needs for communities, marginalized communities, and specific Black communities aren't based upon what's going on for them. It's actually based upon what's going on for us. Right? The inability to allow them to be in music. Is that based upon a defense mechanism that actually induces a need to have control over the music so that people don't surprise you and your musicianship is not questioned or your aesthetic preference is not questioned? Sometimes we're operating out of those very real needs, but it's like, when do those needs actually override the needs of people? Like, we have to question why. Why do our needs override the needs of others that we're supposed to have the capacity to serve, right? Or the capacity to work with or join with. I think there's a lot of food for thought there, Shelby. This is fun. I don't know how y'all are feeling right now, but I'm like, oh, this is fun stuff because we actually get this. I don't know if you've had a lot of opportunities in your different spaces to kind of grapple with these ideas and name some things and critique. I remember working with, and I think Flossie's here in the room. I remember working with a student at one time, and I think Flossie, you and I were in the same class with this particular student. Had a hard time. Hey, Flossie. Previous director of music therapy at Drexel University. And I remember a student kind of talking about like reading an article, a prominent article. Actually, there was a couple articles that they were reading. There was a new article on hip hop, and there was something that was a little bit more prominent overall that talks about culture. And the students in the space would not critique the article. And it's like, I knew that there were problems in the article. Like, there were some blatant generalizations in the article. There were some blatant essentialism in the article. Then there was a bunch of sets of things, this is what you got to do. I'm like, for everybody, is that what it is? Is that the answer? And no one would critique the article. And we sat there and it's like, no one would actually say anything about the article. And then eventually it's like, okay, what's wrong with it? And they're like, are we allowed to say what's wrong with the article? I was like, why not? Like, and if not, like, then what? And it's like, you can find good, you can adore and critique something, or you can, there's a older saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah, you can find something in there and then recognize what else is there. I say, collect that bathwater and do a experiment. I don't know, but kind of like investigate what that is, because we should be able to openly critique, right? It's actually, that's part of our cultural learning, right? To within, in sometimes white supremacist, capitalist, and imperialist structures where we don't have open conflict. It's okay for us to critique, because actually the critique is what enables us to make different shifts, right? And it's usually a collective issue, right? Not just always individuals. It's usually within a culture, we don't allow for that. So being able to navigate that is important. And to ask these questions and ask why, because they'll actually shift us as a culture and as a profession. Shout out to Flossie.
I had kind of a question on something I think you mentioned earlier, but could some of this fear of critiquing be rooted in our fear of kind of our profession's fragility? Or like, oftentimes when you're asked, oh, what's music therapy as a student, you're like, I'm putting 4 years into this degree and hoping, and you have to explain and define what you're doing. Is a lot of this rooted in trying to identify with a structure that's powerful and strong, even though it is systematically harmful and wrong and based in supremacy? Is that kind of a self-preservation tactic too?
Yeah, it is in some ways a self-preservation tactic, but it's also a question of developmentally, have we moved past that, right? It's like, so oftentimes self-preservation or even unconscious defenses exist when you're not able to, primarily defenses, very psychodynamic in some ways in my thinking, but they exist in this kind of unconscious space, right? You do things because you have no other capacity. Your mind actually, or your body won't allow you to go into certain spaces because you're not ready for it. But once that actually moves into your awareness, that means that in some ways you're able, your conscious mind or your unconscious mind finds that you have the capacity to deal with it in whatever level, right? Then this idea of preservation, right? So now we have a consciousness around it, and now we're making active choices to preserve something. However, developmentally, if we're going to take maybe a developmental view too, like to stay in a space of preservation for extensive years, we're not as young as we say we are anymore, right? Yes, we are fighting, different fights around licensure, or yes, we are fighting different, professional fights for funding and insurance and that are connected to licensure. However, it doesn't actually hinder us from actually growing, right? So yeah, we can say that we're trying to preserve ourselves, but actually it stands in the way from us being able to actually move into the places that we want to move in, because our focus then is reduced to holding, right? Instead of like opening and releasing and expanding. And I think there's a realness to that, because preservation is based out of fear, right? It's a fear-based existence. And sometimes you live in a context where preservation is necessary, right? That's the way in which you exist. However, I feel like when you stay there too long, and it's not necessarily useful, it actually there's a way in which we use that as a pathology for our profession too, right? And so I think that that's a place that we need to really interrogate, and again, thinking that everything's connected. If everything's truly connected, then how does self-preservation exist not only in our levels of critique, but how does it exist in our music? I've watched at times therapists or students have struggle with ambiguity. That stuff show in with contexts, or struggle to be able to kind of live in the unknown. That thing shows up in the music making. And somehow we've come up with these ideas that we can exist in one space and completely it not even scathe the place where is our bread and butter, right? It doesn't show up or it can't manifest in the music. And so, or in the relationship, or in any others, it's all connected. And I think in bringing up Breonna Taylor and the case and the results, this was to say that is somehow connected to us. Whether we recognize it or not, our job is to figure out all the ways in which it's connected. It could be on an institutional level, what you have in your educational spheres. It can happen, again, I'll say it over and over again, standards of practice. It can also be within, what you bring into their therapeutic session, what you don't, right? What you share. Some therapists had a hard time navigating that space because the clients were bringing it up and the therapist might not have been ready, or they found new ways to navigate it. However, even if it's not said, it exists in the music. And we may not recognize all those spaces because we haven't allowed ourselves to access it. Sometimes I talk about a client that was in a group around chronic pain that I analyzed for my dissertation, and his pseudonym was Mitchell. And the idea around Mitchell is that Mitchell experienced a microaggression in the session, right? And the therapist wasn't aware of it. The therapist said something. Mitchell is the only Black male in the group, said, don't worry, Mitchell won't shoot us. And everyone says, oh my gosh, how could somebody say that? We say that we do things all the time. So imagine, yourself in a therapy setting. That might not be something that you say, but the reality, the thing that we're thinking about is, at the time, the therapist didn't realize she enacted harm. And then went to kind of go into a musical experiential of sorts, and the harm persisted. Mitchell fought back in the music. I think the therapist wanted to do these elongated vowels and toning and stuff. Mitchell would not have it. And so the idea that there was a level of maybe rigidity in some aspects of that music making for a while. Mitchell kind of going into this percussive, rhythmic, sometimes beatboxing kind of, aesthetic, which is actually, when we think about hip hop and what does that actually mean too, because there was a hip hop kind of flavor to it, linked with some of the R&B rhythms that was his musical background. But the idea that there was actually confrontation, and possibly there, depending upon our lens, we would say that, Mitchell at that time was being aggressive, or Mitchell at that time was being resistant, or and so the question is, if we don't allow ourselves to really understand these contexts, that resistance actually serves in many ways. There are times sometimes when the client resists something that actually needs to be resisted. So it's the idea that those things can happen in the music. The therapist at the time actually shifted. It took a long time of Mitchell not letting go and everyone making music around all these oohs, ahs, and then him mocking all the sounds around him. And then the therapist said, hey, why don't we just join Mitchell wherever he's going at this time? And then something else came from the music. It was beautiful. But after it was, the therapist asked, how was that for you? And Mitchell was like, it put me in my place. And putting one's person in their place is an interesting concept. But here, I think what Mitchell kind of explained later on was this idea that he found his groove and he was staying in his groove as a way of kind of processing and exploring the harm that had happened in the session. So the thing is that it's never really disconnected from what's happening in the space in real time. Our job as clinicians and clinicians in training is to adequately explore all these aspects of ourselves, the places that we are afraid of in service to our clients. You know, some people talk about mastery of the self, like, so that you have full awareness and access to all aspects of yourself, unhindered by your own biases and all your defenses. That's a continuing, ongoing journey. But the level in which the rate in which you progress through that journey, you know, sometimes some of it's out of your own context. I mean, or out of your own you know, determination. Sometimes, you know, it's life. Life hits you in certain ways. It shifts the way in which you experience things. And at other times, you know, oftentimes you have to think about how you're going to apply this. How are you going to shift yourself and move through this work? Hopefully there will be systems and standards around you that help you to do that. Until those standards are created, you're going to have to figure out how does that work? How does that lifelong work? How is that prioritized in your own development as a
professional? I guess if anybody has kind of any last thoughts or questions, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we're coming up on an hour. But if you have any last questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or vocalize them if you wish to. But I want to just take a moment again to thank Marisol for joining us tonight. We really so appreciate your time and your willingness to engage with students in this way. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to everybody who came tonight as well. As Grace kind of mentioned at the beginning of our time here tonight, this was kind of the prelude to Passages, which will take place a week from today. Our theme for Passages is building a new foundation. It's going to take place from 1 to 6 Eastern Time next week, Thursday, October 14th. So our keynote presenter will be Carrie Devlin, and she will be talking about redefining professionalism in the field of music therapy. So a lot of kind of the topics that came up today are going to be explored in greater depth next week. And so if you haven't already, this event will take place via Zoom. You can register via Zoom at this link that I'm dropping in the chat right now. And if you know that you won't be able to join us for the whole time or don't want to register for Zoom or for the Zoom event, you can also join us at the Facebook event that's also linked there, as we will be live streaming to Facebook for the entire event. So we'll have a full day of student presentations as well as our keynote, and a panel of new professionals as they discuss kind of what they have learned to unlearn through the first couple of years of their life as new professionals. So we hope that you'll join us for Passages next week, Thursday. And I also wanted to do a really quick plug to everyone. If you are at all interested in being a part of the AMTAS board and getting to plan events like this and like Passages, as well as help provide resources for fellow students, interns, and new professionals, we hope that you'll consider running for the 2022 Executive Board. This year you can self-nominate for any position that you wish to run for with the link that I just dropped in the chat as well. And if you have any questions about Passages or what it looks like to be a part of the AMTAS Executive Board, you can feel free to email me, which I also just dropped in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. So thank you all again, and a special round of applause and thank you to Marisol, and thanks for joining us tonight. So we hope to see you next week, and hope you all have a great rest of your evening.